Well, thank you guys for being here. Yeah, my story's a little weird. I'm black, but I grew up in a white family, and now I'm ministering to Hispanics, so I just kind of float around to different places. So when I heard Mercado, Emmanuel's last name, I thought I have to ask this guy if he speaks Spanish. I always feel more comfortable speaking Spanish than I speaking English. But good morning. How are you guys? Good? Yeah, to me, if it's before noon, it's morning. So I'm still nursing that coffee that I had an hour ago. Thank you guys so much for being here. I was talking to someone earlier and saying when I walked in, this is my first time here at the conference, I was super intimidated. I just saw a sea of beards and head coverings, and I thought, you know, it's so silly. I've never been so intimidated by people who I knew would never hurt me, right? Because we're all non-resistant here. So, but I wanna thank you for coming, for not being scared off by the title of this talk, which is How to See Color. But just something quick about myself. My name is Eric Miller. I live and work and study in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm originally from Champaign, Illinois, and I'm a ministry student, and I'm studying with the hope of reaching Spanish-speaking people with the gospel. So that's what I'm doing in the Price Hill area of Cincinnati, and I've been going back and forth to Mexico for about the past 10 years to a children's home outside of Mexico City. And I got to know Keyshawn, which is kind of how I got connected to the conference, about a year ago, after, I don't know if you guys, how well you individually are following the news and things of that nature, but last year there was a case in which, can you guys hear me, or should I use the microphone? Can you use the mic? Yeah. Testing. Let's see. Hello. Okay, there we go. So, a year ago, there was a very public, incident with a man who was killed by a police officer. His name was George Floyd. His death was spoken about by a conservative political commentator. And I felt like she had some things to say that were not in line with what we read in the scriptures. And yet I saw a lot of my Christian friends were sharing her video and promoting it. And so I thought, you know what, I think I'm gonna make a response. I just got on Facebook Live, which can be a good idea or a bad idea depending on how you're feeling. And I just kind of gave my thoughts from a biblical perspective, what I thought about what was going on. And to my surprise, nobody really in my own personal life had much to think about it. They kind of, oh, you know, it's Eric, he's talking or whatever. But it got picked up by a lot of young Mennonites. And I started getting friend requests from people with like these German names, and I thought, what is going on here? I don't know. And that's kind of how I got connected with Keyshawn and Restorative Faith, if you're familiar with that. And it's really been a blessing. I had kind of an academic interest in Anabaptism, conservative Anabaptism, from a school perspective, you know, long before this. But getting to be here and to talk with you guys, for you guys to receive me, it really is a great privilege, so I just want to thank you for that. We're going to talk today about how to see color. And if I had to modify the title of this talk, I would say seeing and celebrating color. Because seeing color is only half the battle, right? There are lots of people who see color, but they don't see it for what it is, and they don't see it in the right way. We want to see it, and we want to celebrate it for what God intended. And let me talk for a second about why this is so important to me. I mentioned before that I'm black, but I was raised in a white family. I was a foster child from the age of 3 weeks, basically from birth. My mother was a substance abuser. My father was, my biological father, was incarcerated. And so obviously they were not able to take care of me. So I was a ward of the state basically from birth. And then I was adopted as a toddler at the age of 3. And I'll tell you, I had the best, godliest parents. And I had a wonderful, blessed upbringing. But they didn't necessarily have manuals for this kind of thing. And my parents were doing the best job they could, and they definitely did an amazing job. But they had a perspective on how to deal with having a black child that was basically, you're our son, which is true. We don't love you any less, than any of our other children. I have 5 older siblings, which is true. You are just like the rest of our children, which is kind of true, kind of not. And so we're not going to talk about the fact that you're black, because that doesn't matter to us. We're just going to go on as if there was no problem, there was no issue, there was no color difference at all, because it doesn't make any difference to us that you're black, which of course it didn't to my parents. What they meant by this was the best. This was their understanding of how to deal with the issue. But it didn't work. It didn't work for some of the reasons we're going to look at a little bit later, and it had a very negative impact on my own personal development. Because even though we were not talking about race and the fact that I looked different than my siblings, other people were. Kids on the playground, at school, at church, and not talking about that failed to equip me to be able to answer the questions or respond to the objections or the taunts or whatever else that people were bringing at me. And so this is one of the small problems I had with what I would call kind of a colorblind view of race. And we're going to get to some explanation of terms here in a second. On the collegiate level, I did debate. And as any debater will tell you, what you want in a debate is something called clash. Now that sounds bad, but in debate it's actually a good thing. It means that your arguments and your opponent's arguments are going right up against each other, and you're engaging with each other on a substantive level. But in order to have clash, you have to make sure you're using the key terms of the debate in the same way. And this is something that when we talk about race, I find is the biggest problem. We're all using the same terms, but we're not talking about the same thing. So let me define some key terms that we're going to use in this talk, so I know that we're all on the same page. The first term is color. And I don't have a PowerPoint or a slide or anything like that, but if anything here helped you, I can get your email afterwards and I can email you my notes and my outline. But here's a definition I have for color. Pigmentation of skin, especially as an indicator of someone's race. So these are not going to be specialized definitions here. These are things that you could just look up in a dictionary, but just so that we know what we're talking about. Color is pigmentation of skin, especially as an indicator of someone's race. Race would be people who share the same culture, history, language. Race, a group of people who share the same history, culture, or language. Nationality, the status of belonging to a particular nation. Racism, prejudice or discrimination based on race. And here's how I'm going to define colorblind. This is the view that race-based differences are inconsequential, and that focus on race is a source of racial division. So colorblind is that race-based differences are inconsequential, and it's the focus on race that's the source of racial division. So most of us here are probably from the United States, so we share the same nationality, but we don't, most of us, or well, I guess most of you do share the same race. Some of us don't share the same race. So we're all Americans, but we're all, that doesn't mean we're the same color, we're the same race. And I want to talk a little bit about the problems with this colorblind approach, the idea that race-based differences are inconsequential, and that focusing on race is what causes racial division. The first problem is that it ignores the reality of sin. The colorblind approach to race ignores the reality of sin. Biblically speaking, where does the Bible identify the origin of sin? I'm not thinking of Adam and Eve, but like, where does sin come from? You can just shout it out. Pardon me? It comes from inside us. It comes from inside our hearts, right? Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? Jesus says, the good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, but the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. Out of the heart come evil desires, and so on and so forth. But what the colorblind approach to race does is it locates the sin not in the person's heart, not in the source of the prejudice that comes from within, but the difference that's external. So the issue here is that you're black and I'm white. If we don't focus on that, then the problem's going to go away. But see, the problem isn't that you're white and I'm black. The problem is that somebody has a problem with that. And that comes from within. That comes from inside. Have you ever heard the phrase, God doesn't see color? I've heard that before. I was just talking to a coworker the other day, and she mentioned that she was fostering children, and I said, oh yeah, I was a foster child or whatever, and I was explaining where I was coming from, and we got to talking about race and things, and I explained some of the issues that I had and how I worked through them, and she was kind of surprised, that I had any kind of a problem at all. And she said, but God doesn't see color, kind of as a way to shut down the discussion. Like, we can't talk about race. God doesn't see color. Or maybe around Martin Luther King Jr. Day, you hear that quote that's kind of put out like, one day I hope that my 4 children will be judged, not by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. Now that's a great quote, but sometimes that's used to promote this idea of being colorblind, which if you read anything else by Martin Luther King Jr., you know that that's not, that wasn't really his speed. Or something I see a lot now is this quote by Morgan Freeman. The problem with racism is that we're talking about it. So I'm not going to call you a white man, and you're not going to call me a black man. That's just going to solve the problem. These are the kinds of things that I mentioned because I see them quoted at me, to people on social media to promote this idea of being colorblind. But the problem isn't that we're different. The problem is that people have a problem with that we're different. And ignoring the reality of our differences isn't going to solve the problem. We have to deal with the sin problem in people's hearts. The second reason that the colorblind approach doesn't work is because it ignores the reality of personal prejudice. And this is kind of closely connected to the first point. And I still remember, I don't know, I was probably 15 or so. I was taking the bus back home from going somewhere, and I sat down next to this lady, and like how somebody makes a face, like when they smell something bad? That was the face that she made when I sat down to her, sat down next to her. And she called me the N-word out of nowhere. This lady, I'm sitting, and I just sat down next to her on the bus. And at that point in my life, I had not had somebody be that aggressively racist to me because my parents were very protective. They did not allow me around people who talked that way, and I didn't really know how to deal with the situation. How do we protect or speak up for people who are being discriminated in that sense if we're colorblind? If we aren't looking at, okay, this lady has a problem with this guy simply because of the color of his skin. I was talking to one of my coworkers the other day. She's from Zambia, and she was telling me about her first job that she got here in the United States, working at Panera Bread. And she said it was the worst job she'd ever had. And she was working in one of the richer areas I live in Ohio, but it's just on the border of Kentucky. She was working in Kentucky in one of the richer areas. And she talked about how some of the older Caucasian white folks would come in and they would see her and they would ask, can I get somebody else to make the salads? They didn't feel comfortable with her, touching the food. And she said, she was the only black person who worked there. How do we stand up and speak truth to power in these situations if we don't really know what's going on because we're blind to the situation? You see, what helped me in the situation that I was in was a white man who was sitting in the booth in the bus in front of me who said, wait a second, don't talk to him like that. And I didn't have another adult except this guy who didn't know me from Adam, who chose to see the situation and speak up. If only somebody had been there to speak up for my coworker, but the only way that we can do that is if we choose to not be colorblind in these situations. The third reason why the colorblind approach doesn't work is because it ignores the reality of majority privilege. And privilege is a buzzword that's being thrown around in our culture right now. And don't turn me off because you hear the word privilege. All right, I want to explain what I mean by that. So I was in a Bible study with some conservative Anabaptists. Some of my best friends, we had Mennonites, we had German brethren, and then there was me. Yeah, I don't know. I'm attracted to the weird folks. No, no. I was a weird one in the group. I'll tell you that. But we were talking about an issue because we share a lot of the same beliefs, even though I'm not personally Anabaptist or Mennonite. Head coverings. I don't participate in politics. I'm non-resistant. There's just a lot of overlap. We were talking about something with regards to the police and policing and things of that nature. And there was a little bit of a disagreement. It was a totally, an amicable disagreement. But I asked my friend, I said, but you would call the police in that situation, right? And he said, well, I'd have to think about it. I'm talking to my Mennonite friend. And I'm like, but you would call the police in that situation? He's like, well, no, I'd have to think about it. And we started to get talking, and finally I stopped in the middle of our Bible discussion. I said, have you never called the police before? And he's like, well, no. I'm like, how is it possible that you've lived your adult life and you've never had to call the police before for an issue, for a problem? He lived in a culture, in an area where he had never had to call 911 because somebody was, had jumped into their backyard and was trying to steal their bike or something. That wasn't a personal example. That never happened a million times to us growing up. Or because there was a fight, or any of the million of other reasons that I've had to call the police since I've lived in Cincinnati, much less growing up in the ghetto in Champaign. We had two completely different frames of reference, where for him, he's like, yeah, that's a moral dilemma whether or not I call the police in that situation. I'm like, I feel like I called the police, every other day during the summer, when people were out doing crazy stuff. When we are colorblind, we don't realize that when you live in a particular area, or when you are in the majority in a country, whether it be language, whether it be race, whether it be culture, you can afford to not see things that other people cannot afford to see. My parents and my siblings could afford to not see and notice the fact that I was black because it didn't really affect them in the way that it affected me. I couldn't afford to not see it because it was a constant reminder. It was my everyday reality. And if I wasn't thinking about it, people around me were helping me to think about it. They were bringing it up. And so this is, again, another reason why, just thinking through why the colorblind approach doesn't work. Two more. One is that it ignores the goodness of God's creation. Racial differences are not a bad thing. Sin is a bad thing. Racial differences, cultural differences, language differences are not a bad thing. That's one of the things. I work at Amazon. That's my secular job. It's my real job. And what I love about working at Amazon is that we've got people from Zambia, from Palestine, from all over Latin America, from all over Africa, from every part of the world. At the lunch table, it feels like the United Nations. Like people are talking in all their different languages and dialects, and that's beautiful. It's a picture of what it's going to be when we're all redeemed around the throne of God worshiping. That's not a bad thing. But when we're colorblind to those kinds of things, when we don't want to pay attention to those differences, we miss out on that goodness that God has created, that He's purposed. It'd be like if we're all going to pretend like all the flowers are the same, or all the trees are all God's, physical creation. Well, no, because we miss the beauty of the differences and the complexity and the colors and the array of specificity that God has created. Well, we do the same thing when we ignore the differences in His human creation, which is far greater than even the physical natural creation. And all of this leads to the answer that the reason the colorblind approach doesn't work is because it's not reality-based. It's not based in reality. We are different, and so we need to figure out how to work through those differences in a Christ-like and biblical manner. So what I want to switch to now for a second is answer some objections, kind of preemptively answer some objections that I have heard to this approach. And I was really nervous about this first objection, but I think his name is Rick, right? The speaker who we had, the plenary speaker, answered it very well, so I don't even have to spend much time on this, and that's the just preach the gospel objection. Why do we even need to focus about this? Why do we need to talk about race? Shouldn't we just preach the gospel? And the reason why it's a difficult objection is because when you're answering the objection, you can give the impression that the gospel is, you're devaluing the gospel. And I never want to do that. We're gospel people. That's what I'm about. I'm about sharing the gospel with people who don't know Jesus. But we don't believe in magic, okay? The gospel is enculturated. Like Rick was saying, we have to speak the gospel in a way that people can understand it. It's not just magic words that we throw out into the air and expect it to change people. It takes hard work to go to a particular area, to figure out who the people are, what their needs are, what language that they're speaking, what the culture is, and then present the gospel, not change it, but present the gospel in a way that they can hear it. I think about the people in James, in the book of James, where he's writing to these folks who are clearly having a problem with classism. Remember, he says, if a man dressed in fine clothes comes into your meeting and you give him a good space, but a man, dressed in shabby clothes comes in, you say, here, sit on the floor by my feet. These people had heard the gospel. These people were in church, but they didn't know how to apply the gospel to their particular cultural situation. If you look in the book of Philippians, and Philippi was if you know anything about the background, I won't get too much into it, was a Roman colony. And they prided themselves on the fact that a lot of retired military generals were there in Philippi. And in Roman culture in general, you showed your status by the way that you dressed. People who weren't Roman citizens couldn't even wear the toga. They were wearing, rags, and then the people who were the generals, they, had purple sashes and all kinds of other stuff like that. And so when you understand what the background of the culture of Philippians is, when you get to that hymn in Philippians chapter 2, which I think is like 4 to 11, something like that, where it says that each one of you should have the attitude, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, and being made in human likeness, he made himself nothing, becoming obedient, even obedience to death on a cross. And that word form of God and form of servant in the Greek morphe refers to an outward expression. So he would have been seen in glorious brightness, almost like on the Mount of Transfiguration. But he traded all of that for the form of a slave. And so you have these people in Philippi dressed to the hilt because they're generals and they're Roman citizens, and they're looking and seeing, oh my goodness, Jesus, who was dressed, arrayed in all this glory, took the form, the clothing of the least among us. And they would have gotten that. Because Paul knew their culture. He met them where they lived. He knew where their pride was, and he addressed them right there. It wasn't a question of whether or not we preach the gospel. It's about contextualizing the gospel in a way that affects people, that people can understand. Does that make sense? Another objection is, isn't this just like a social gospel? Isn't this just like political liberalism? Isn't this just, social justice warrior stuff? And my question or answer to that, answering with a question, is, was Hudson Taylor a social justice warrior? This amazing missionary who I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals, who pioneered dressing like the people, talking like the people. He had the top knot, reaching these people who he knew God had called him to reach. No, he understood what it meant to become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might reach some. That's what he was trying to do. Well, was Mother Teresa, preaching a social gospel when she went to live among the poorest of the poor? I brought this book because I just happened to have it with me. If you are looking for a book to inspire you in your ministry, it's called A Passion for the Impossible by who has heard of Lilias Trotter? A couple people here. She is just an amazing and inspiring missionary. She was in Algeria, northern Africa, before almost anybody was there. And just reading her stories of how you're talking about how I taught myself Spanish. She taught herself Arabic. This lady taught herself Arabic in an era before Duolingo and, Rosetta Stone. She had a passion for meeting the people where they were at in their culture. These people didn't know, and they weren't liberals. It wasn't a social gospel. It was really just common sense. If you're going to meet people with the gospel of Jesus, you have to incarnate yourself in that culture, just like Jesus incarnated himself, took on flesh to live among us. Reverse racism. Reverse racism, and I kind of had an asterisk here. What about White History Month? Because that's something that I get asked about a lot. In other words, we can celebrate every color, every culture, but we can't celebrate white culture. This is something that I get asked all the time, and I'm slowing down here because I want to make sure I choose my words carefully, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I know I'm among friends and brethren here. A lot of this has to do with how things like blackness and whiteness have functioned historically in our country, and so we don't talk about them the same way. Let me first say, it is a beautiful and God-given thing that you are what we call white, that you have the color of skin that you have the culture that you have, just like it's a beautiful and God-given thing that I'm black. But because of the specific historical circumstances of let's just stick with America, of the United States of America, we don't talk about these things the same way, even though it's on equal footing. We don't have a White History Month, for example, because for a while every month was White History Month. Some people say, well, we have a black entertainment television. Well, for a while everything was white entertainment television, The reason these kinds of things came about is because when black people came over on slave ships, they weren't black. They had their own cultures, they had their own tribes, they had their own people and ethnicities, but they got lumped together with a label of black. And then over time, that label was reclaimed by those people to kind of have their own culture and their own form of identification, and has become a point of pride. And not in the bad sense, but a point of like, okay, we're rallying around, we have this in common, maybe better than pride, a point of commonality. Unfortunately, when people say things like, if I just said, imagine I was a white person, I'm proud to be white, or white is great, or white power, white pride, immediately, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about Ku Klux Klan, you're thinking about Jim Crow, you're thinking about racism, because that just happens to be the history of our country. So it's not that there's anything wrong with being white, and it's not that we don't celebrate white culture. We can celebrate German culture, we can celebrate Italian culture, we can celebrate Polish culture. To me, that's the way in which we celebrate white culture, but the reason that the terminology is different is because the way that the celebration of whiteness has manifested in this country has largely been the celebration of supremacy. And there's just no easy way around that. And so I understand my white brothers and sisters who sometimes just feel frustrated. Like, is there something wrong with me? Do I have to apologize? No, you don't have to apologize for your culture. You don't have to apologize for the way that God made you. I just hope that we can be sensitive to why we talk about blackness and whiteness a little bit differently, simply because of the historical context in which we're living in. I've got 10 minutes left. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so let me skip down to, I don't want to just talk about what's wrong with the colorblind approach. I want to mention a constructive solution. So in place of being colorblind, I want to say that we should be color conscious. And let me just quote to you what I mean by that. To be color conscious is to seek to recognize the various ways race, color, nationality affect our lives and respond accordingly. So we're seeking to recognize the various ways race, color, nationality affect our lives and respond accordingly. So I think this is a much better, and I'll just give you one example because I do want to leave time for questions. In my specific context in Price Hill, we have a booming community of Guatemalan immigrants, mostly from rural Guatemala, not from like Guatemala City. And the general demographics of the Priceville area of Cincinnati is white Appalachian, black African American like myself, and then these Guatemalan people who are coming over. Over the past couple of summers, we've had a lot of difficulty in terms of tension between black members of the community to a certain extent, and then our Latino neighbors. We had some groups of black teenagers who had victimized some Guatemalan immigrants who had come over, and that just basically struck fear in the whole community, and they were already very scared and reticent to talk to black people, but now it's just getting even more difficult to reach them with the gospel, to even be friends with them. About the only foot that I have in is that I have Spanish and that they know me. I've been doing stuff in there for a couple years now. The reason that they were targeted for these robberies is specifically because of racial differences. So for example, in Guatemala, there's not a debit card kind of culture, okay? Everybody carries cash. So you have these Guatemalan folks who are walking around the neighborhood with these large amounts of cash, okay? That's the first problem. I don't even leave my house with change. So, that's the first issue. The second issue is the majority of these people who are coming over are not documented. So they don't want to call the police. Even though the police don't really have anything to do with immigration and customs enforcement, they don't know that, they don't get that, and it's not worth it to them to be sent back. So they're not going to call the police. So that makes them another easy victim for crime. Another issue is, physiologically speaking, they tend to be very short. So I'm a short guy. I'm short. I'm like 5'3" and a half, and I gotta get that half in there. I'll take as much as I can get. And you can have grown men that are just this tall. So they're very small, and they tend not to fight back. If we're having the colorblind approach, we're lost to all of those reasons, very important reasons for why they're specifically being targeted for violence. But if we're being color conscious, we're going to look at the situation. We're going to try to thoughtfully consider, okay, how is race a factor here? And then we're going to put into place some solutions. So some of the solutions that we've had is to have Spanish language education, teaching people things like, okay, when you go out of your house, you only take the money that you need, to go, if you're going to go to Kroger for what you need to get groceries. Don't have your whole, paycheck that you just got, sticking out of your pocket, that sort of thing. Go in groups. Don't just go out by yourself. Make sure you're going in groups. We made sure people understood the Cincinnati police are not going to call immigration on you, if you report a crime. These kinds of things. I'm just trying to help you think. This is what I think is so much better of a constructive approach to dealing with these issues, rather than just saying, we're going to pretend they don't exist, we're going to pretend we're all the same, because that's just not the reality of the situation. Does that make sense? So I'm going to kind of cut it off right there and ask if you guys have any questions. Any questions for me? Anything that you were thinking about? Maybe questions about how this might apply to the ministries that you guys are working in. But not everybody at once, please. How many of you guys are in full-time ministry? Okay, we have a couple. Raise your hands high. Okay, all right. I'm gonna pick on some people. You two, what kind of ministry are you doing? Yeah.
We work with the Spanish Church Planting Harrisburg.
Pardon me?
We work with the Spanish Church Planting Harrisburg.
All right, I gotta get together with you guys afterwards. That's awesome. Very cool. Okay, awesome. How about you? Somebody else raise their hand. Yeah.
Same thing.
Okay, very cool. Some else people raise their hand for full-time ministry. Who else were you guys? Now they're scared. Yeah.
I work at a food bank, and I deliver food to a lot of ethnic groups,
Okay.
churches, and also go to the city and always running into a lot of different cultures that live there.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think one of the feelings about the color conscious approach, to use your terminology there, is, well, it sounds You guys are the artists and the ball players, and we're, whatever it is, like how,
Yeah.
it doesn't, how would you deal with someone that feels like, well, that leads to kind of stereotypes
Yeah.
about culture and skin color that aren't helpful?
That's a good question. I expect a good question from you.
Can you rephrase this question and then answer it?
Yeah, so Josh is basically asking, the color conscious approach, doesn't this lead to ideas of separate but equal? We're acknowledging that we're different, like I mentioned the examples of the flowers are different, but how does that not lead to, my flower is better than your flower, that kind of the ethnocentrism that we were talking about earlier. It's a great question, and I want to go back to what is the reality of the situation, okay? I'm interested in reality-based solutions. The reality of the situation is that we are different. The reality of the situation is that we have different cultures or that we speak different languages. That's just the facts of the matter. And then I'm trying to build on those facts to create solutions that work for communities, churches, ministries, or whatever. So the issue with thinking that one culture is better than another culture, or just kind of dividing ourselves into our own special groups, I want to push back against the imaginary objectioner and say that doesn't come from acknowledging the realities that exist around us. That comes from something that's going on inside of me. And if there's a tendency or an inclination inside of me to think that my way of doing it is better because my culture is better than your culture, the answer to that isn't to pretend that we don't have different cultures. The answer to that is to lay down my pride at the cross. It's to repent of my sin. It's to get over that and understand that has nothing to do with Christ. I quoted Philippians chapter 2. It also says each one of you should consider not only his own interests, but the interests of others. You should consider each other better than yourselves. Like that's the answer to that. And so when we're thinking about these issues, we have to not think that the issue is the difference. The issue isn't the difference. The issue is that there's a problem that we have a difference. That's kind of how I would go at approaching that question.
I think that I just ask a follow-up.
Absolutely.
And I think then, one of the difficulties that we white people are sometimes afraid of is how to talk about these differences. So I'll give you an example, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
So I might think, well, you know what, in our society, the NBA seems like a lot of black people are playing in the NBA. And so therefore I see you and, hey, you probably enjoy basketball, right? Now,
I do not have the hype for basketball.
if you did, right? You might, I might be afraid, I'm going to offend somebody by making a generalization about the type of flower that they are, and how do I sort of respect the identity or culture while also not stereotyping what culture I think they fall into.
So yeah, raise the question. How do we speak to culture without falling into generalizations and stereotypes? First of all, let me say, when you're learning culture, you're gonna step on toes and you're gonna make mistakes. That's just part of it. I stepped on toes and made mistakes when I went to Mexico. I've done it here in reaching the Guatemalans in Price Hill. That's just part of it. And you just have to hope that the people you're talking to are gonna give you grace. Give yourself a lot of grace, because it's not easy, and kudos to you for even beginning to start that journey. The way that we don't fall into those generalizations, I don't know any other way to do it except you just have to start getting to know people and talking to people, okay? Because you don't know what you don't know until you know it, right? And so the best expert on culture is a person from that culture. So I'm gonna sit with them, and I'm gonna talk to them, and I'm gonna spend some time with them, and I'm not gonna be the teacher for a little bit. I'm gonna be a student, and I'm gonna be a listener, and I'm gonna be an observer. And that way, I'm not gonna come in and I'm just gonna, like a bull in the china shop, and make people feel uncomfortable or fall into stereotypes and generalizations and things of that nature. If I can stop for a second and listen to what the people are saying and meet them where they're at and have a genuine interest in them, I think you're going to go a long way in understanding the culture, not from like a generalization and stereotype superficial level, but actually on a deep substantive level. So We are about out of time. I want to read to you one passage of scripture before we close. This is in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who lived on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." We are here because we believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I literally could not care less what your political views are, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, whether you voted for this person or that person. The only thing that I'm waiting for is the kingdom of God to be manifested on earth. I'm waiting for the return of Jesus. And until then, my only concern, my primary concern is preaching this gospel to every nation, tribe, tongue, and language. But in order to do that, we have to see them. So my prayer for you guys is that you see them, and that you don't just see them, but you celebrate them, and you celebrate them in the places where God has put you. Thank you guys so much.